Today on the BMC podcast, we are speaking to Niki Frantzeskaki and Marc Wolfram about urban transformations, a new journal launching this year.
So, can you both introduce yourselves and tell us about how you got into the field of urban transformations and what you work on day to day?
Yeah, well, I have a rather undisciplined academic background. I studied in architecture and did my PhD in planning, and then moved further into different strands of social sciences and sustainability sciences. And since 2002, I worked as a consultant and as a researcher in Europe. There I collaborated with city governments and city networks and the European Commission on a pretty wide range of urban sustainability issues, essentially. But in 2013, I was appointed as associate professor for urban sustainability in Seoul, South Korea. And since then, I've been focusing entirely on questions of urban transformation. So a variety of topics, some like energy transition, social innovation, or urban regeneration, or digitalization in cities as well. So that's where I'm coming from.
Hi, good morning. I'm Niki. I have studied environmental engineering, and more during my studies, my first degree, I became more interested on how can we improve livability in our cities, and especially how to bring together not only the engineering aspects, but also the policy aspects and planning aspects. That drove me to pursue my master's at TU Delft in the Netherlands, in engineering and policy analysis. That since then, and including also my PhD, I did research including all the environmental policy and environmental socio-ecological dimensions for cities. Then is where I became part of the, at that point, newly founded research studies on sustainability transitions. And I have to say, since 2009, I've been working very much on doing research on all the factors, all the things that they make cities radically change in terms of technology, in terms of communities, and in terms of all the interwoven urban fabrics.
So, what exactly do you mean by urban transformations?
Yeah, I think that might be best understood if we think about it historically. With each phase of civilization, for instance, like from the feudal residence city to the modern industrial city, we've seen human settlements become completely reconfigured. So changing their relation to nature, spatial layouts, designs, infrastructure, architectures, mobility, all that together with patterns of production, consumption, social and political organization, cultural expressions, and so forth. So urban transformation refers to such deep and dynamic holistic changes in urban structures, cultures, and practices. And that ultimately brings about a new type of human settlement. I think that for conceiving of that, we need really to adopt a relational perspective. That means that when we speak of the urban, that is certainly not only the local scales, and not just the city or the urban region or the metropolitan area, but it's more the processes and the patterns and the dynamics that actually span the entire globe that lead to the manifestation anchored in particular places that we call urban or a city then.
To add to this, I would also say if we look even the cities that are urbanizing in a fast-paced rhythm nowadays, if you look on Mexico City, if you look on Melbourne, if you look in a number of cities in China, you see that the way infrastructure is being laid down, the way they attract new people being arrival places, the way lifestyles in cities change because of this new investment in infrastructure, because of the fluid demographic changes. These are all very interesting phenomena that you cannot study in isolation. You cannot just study how infrastructure change and how it changed the life of people, but how all these, they play a role at the same time. And urban transformations is exactly this. Is a phenomenon that captures this multi-scale and multi-sectoral, complicated phenomenon that happen in the cities, and is very interesting for us to understand, and is very interesting for us to study, not only because of the complexity, but because it immediately relates to the current life in cities, to the quality of life, the quality of the environment, and also to the future that we are going to have in the planet overall.
And what are the main challenges in the field of urban transformations?
Yeah, maybe to start out with the big picture there, I guess it's the conjunction of two megatrends, which on the one hand side is the ecological crisis that we are facing, and urbanization as a continued megatrend on the other hand. So with the ecological crisis, obviously I refer to climate change, just very much illustrated and reinforced by the latest IPCC report on global warming, and but equally, of course, issues like biodiversity loss or changes in the geochemical flows, changes in water availability, food security, food provisioning systems. So there are a number of ecological crises going on right now, which actually have moved humanity outside the safe operating space that we have had on this planet so far. So that is putting a lot of pressures, of course, on action. And on the other hand, urbanization is continuing. Vast majority of the global population is already living in cities, and this is certainly increasing. The UN speaks of some 70% by 2030, but for instance, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission estimates that already in 2015 it was about 85%. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that, but the quantitative relevance of the urban will, of course, increase, and much of that will happen in the global south, will happen in Southeast Asia and Africa. And on the other hand, we have patterns of stagnation and shrinkage in Europe in particular, but also in East Asia. So there are different starting points in terms of urban, and in order to face this ecological crisis. And I think this is really the key challenge for people thinking and addressing this field of urban transformations, because urbanization must eventually become the solution to the global ecological crisis. We need to essentially reconnect our cities to the biosphere. We need to rethink them economically. We need to reorganize them politically, socially, and thereby to also reinvent them technically and culturally. So there's a huge transformational challenge ahead in terms of what cities are and how they work, how they function.
To add to this, it's not only for informing policy and planning, but also on questioning what type of science we want for the cities. So it is, in a way, a feedback loop there, that because of the global picture, because of the emerging and interconnected challenges that they come from the everyday life in cities, the investments that are going to be made in urban infrastructure that will require some guidance or evidence base from science. At the same time, understanding how cities change, and from the local to the global picture of urban transformations, it will also require some changes in the way science is being conducted. And for us, urban transformations exactly challenges the full cycle of actors. Is about how do you make better, more robust, socially responsible urban policy, considering that all these urban transformations are in place or need to be accelerated. How do you bring knowledge and science from a multitude of actors into the picture to create more evidence-based policy for urban transformations, but at the same time, how the different information, question, and stimuli that they come from urban transformations also challenge the role of researchers and the role of science itself. And it is a very interesting field and a very interesting phenomenon to investigate.
So how does this new journal, Urban Transformations, address those challenges compared to other journals that publish related research?
Yeah, I think that in the first place, we want our authors and also guest editors to engage with transformations up front. So what we say is that all urban perspectives or disciplines are valid, they are needed, but we want them to say more specifically what they can contribute to understand and to also steer and accelerate transformation. So that's a direct contribution, of course, with this focus compared to many of the publishing outlets that there are. On the other hand, we also put a strong emphasis and give priority to outcomes from science-practice interactions, where in the work, not only researchers, but also urban stakeholders have been fully involved. Because such knowledge co-production is actually needed for developing new orientations, but also guidance and concrete recommendations for how to implement urban transformations. Yeah, we also we're less interested in ivory tower research. We certainly want contributions that do formulate clear lessons for stakeholder groups, and that's something we also require, namely recommendations for science and also for policy and practice. And we also offer quite diverse article formats in order to actually tailor that to the requirements of both scientists and practitioners. That means they have different lengths, different formats, and we're not prescriptive about article lengths in there. Also, we consider that as a recommendation and use then rather case-by-case decisions. So that is, of course, a flexibility that an online journal can offer to authors.
And to highlight what Marc already said, we really believe that the field of urban transformations is multidisciplinary. So there are many different disciplines that they can understand, they can give meaning, and they can also offer novel insights and novel conceptualizations for understanding urban transformations, with a focus on what it implies for policy, what it implies for practice. So we really believe in the diversity and plurality of science for urban transformations. Therefore, we also have this diversity of different paper formats to exactly welcome this type of diversity also of research outputs, and especially those that they come from the science policy and practice collaborations.
And what would a typical paper in urban transformations look like?
Yeah, first of all, I think there will be different types of typical papers. So we expect to have a certain mixture and balance between the formats that we offer. So of course there will be classical research papers, but we also put a lot of emphasis on reviews, where the point is, of course, to gather and synthesize very strongly the state of the art in a particular field, in a particular subsection, or combining different fields with a specific research question on urban transformation. And we also try to focus on particular front lines in terms of research. So topics and issues that are highly innovative, that really push the boundaries of the field. We want to feature them in frontiers papers that really open up new areas and new perspectives for the field. We also have more opinion pieces and shorter pieces that are practice case-based. So there are a lot of a variety of different perspectives that all contribute, of course, to the overarching endeavor here to complement different types of knowledges and to inspire a dialogue and a discussion among different fields, and also between policy and practice.
Well, I think Marc said it all. What I want to stress again is exactly the diversity that we offer. And in a number of other disciplinary or interdisciplinary journals, you find a very typical format of science papers or short communications. For us, in our journal, you're going to find very different type of formats, especially when you have a new theory, new conceptualization that it has the potential to push the frontier of science for urban transformations. These are really welcomed, and especially the truly transdisciplinary papers are the ones that we really expect to see coming towards the journal and having a space for opening up the debate and the dialogue further. So I would invite the community of urban transformations to take a look on the atypical diverse paper formats that we propose in the journal, and try them out and even challenge us on even more innovative formats for the future.
And do you have an example of a transformational change currently underway in a city that you think is leading the way?
Yeah, I recently came across the case of Gothenburg, which is, of course, it's a Scandinavian city, so certainly a bit leading in terms of sustainability policies anyways. But this is a particular interesting case because what the city started to do was to give out green bonds to finance actually activities like implementing green infrastructure or renewable energy facilities, public transport projects, because of course urban transformations of the kind that we need, they require massive changes in terms of investment, and that is a very interesting case that has actually triggered that in a smart way. Or from a very different cultural and socio-political context, Suwon, a city here in South Korea that has started to leverage change from a very different angle, namely more through citizen participation, where through very active formats of involving citizens in decision-making, in planning, in strategy making, the city has been the first to adopt its own SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and has created a already adopted council framework for participation in any kind of strategy making and planning that the city is devising. So there are now institutional frameworks in place to actually change the way how the city is going about its own development in all the policy fields.
And for me, and next to these two examples, I'm going to talk about Glasgow in Scotland. It's a city that has been well studied, you might say, because of all the socioeconomic challenges the city has been facing over the last years. But now the city, the last years, and that's going to continue, of course, uses the open space strategy as a way to actually regenerate all public space into high quality green space, but having in the horizon also a more social policy agenda in terms of radically changing and adapting and transforming the way public space looks, being used, serves for climate change adaptation, but at the same time on being the space for social encounter and even for social political activation. And this is very radical. Some of the pilots already under the open space strategy are really promising, especially in deprived neighborhoods. And the city has been engaging not only with, you might say, business as usual workshops and consultations, but also with online engagement, with apps for the youth, even with door-to-door dialogues with citizens. So these, you might say, new forms of engagement, new way of understanding the importance of public space as multifunctional space, the ways they also leverage resources for that, from crowdsourcing to community budgeting to investing from the philanthropic sector to also repurposing funds for it and keep a short-term and long-term perspective to it is very transformative. And of course, it relates to the ongoing transformations of post-industrialization, of demographic change that the city of Glasgow undergoes, and the transformations they want to see in their cities. For me, this type of complex phenomena, this socio-economic complexity that we see in cities, and also how environmental elements play out in it is something very interesting to see, very valuable to contribute in this science policy and community interface. And I think inviting and having papers that capture this, analyzing it, and giving a critical take on the transformations at hand and the transformations that the cities want can also stimulate, create the evidence and the example for other cities and other researchers around the globe to pursue and to be inspired and informed about.
Urban Transformations is now open for submissions at urbantransformations.biomed-central.com in partnership with BMC.